Imagine being trapped in a world of endless ice. No phones, no radios, no chance of rescue. Just you, 27 others, and a frozen wilderness so deadly that no human being was ever meant to survive it. This is not fiction. It happened. A forgotten chapter of history where survival seemed impossible, yet against all odds, something extraordinary unfolded. It was 1914, a time before GPS, before satellites, before the safety nets of modern technology. A ship called Endurance set out with one of the boldest missions ever attempted, to cross Antarctica on foot. But what began as an ambitious dream quickly turned into one of the greatest survival sagas in human history. The hidden truth? The mission failed completely. Yet what followed was far more miraculous, a story so unbelievable, so raw, that it has been called the greatest adventure story ever told. How did 28 men, stranded in the most hostile place on Earth, survive nearly 2 years without losing a single life? Stay with me, because what you're about to hear will change the way you think about courage, leadership, and the human spirit. To understand this story, we need to go back to an era when much of the world was still unknown. The early 1900s were called the heroic age of Antarctic exploration. Nations raced to plant their flags on the frozen continent, a place so remote and unforgiving it was often described as the last great wilderness on Earth. In this age of exploration, one man stood above the rest, Sir Ernest Shackleton. Born in Ireland and raised in London, Shackleton was ambitious, stubborn, and restless. He had already been to Antarctica twice, and though he had come close, he had never reached his ultimate dream. To carve his name into history, Shackleton now planned something no one had ever dared attempt: to march across the entire Antarctic continent, from one side to the other, a distance of nearly 3,000 kilometers. The plan was audacious. Shackleton and his crew would sail through the ice-choked Weddell Sea, land near Vassal Bay, and begin their trek across the frozen heart of Antarctica. They would pass through the South Pole itself and emerge on the far side at the Ross Sea, where another team was preparing supply depots to support them. If all went perfectly, the crossing would take 120 days, but this was a journey in which even the smallest mistake could mean disaster. On November 4, 1914, Shackleton's ship, the Endurance, left South Georgia Island, the last outpost of civilization before the endless ice. At her helm were 28 men, sailors, scientists, a surgeon, a photographer, even a carpenter. They were not just crewmates. They were a team united by adventure, ready to risk everything for a place in history. Yet even before they reached Antarctica, ominous warnings appeared. The whalers on South Georgia Island, men who spent their lives battling the southern seas, urged Shackleton to wait. They told him the Weddell Sea was unusually clogged with ice that year. To push forward now, they said, would be suicide. But Shackleton was not a man easily swayed. With confidence, or perhaps stubbornness, he pressed on. At first, progress was steady. The Endurance weaved her way through towering ice floes, her black hull cutting a path through the frozen maze. But the deeper they sailed into the Weddell, the thicker the ice became. Day after day, they forced the ship forward, always believing open water lay just ahead. Then, on January 18, 1915, everything changed. With a groan of timber and a shudder that echoed through the decks, the Endurance stopped dead. She was locked fast, trapped in the grip of the ice. For 3 desperate hours, her engines strained. Men with axes hacked at the frozen prison, but it was hopeless. The sea had claimed her. The expedition to cross Antarctica had ended before it even began. The hidden truth was clear. Shackleton and his men were no longer explorers. They were prisoners, drifting on a frozen wasteland at the bottom of the world. The Endurance was frozen solid, her wooden hull creaking under the pressure of the ice. At first, Shackleton hoped the spring thaw might free them. Until then, the men set about creating a winter camp on board, turning the trapped ship into a floating fortress of survival. They hunted seals and penguins, played games, even held mock concerts to keep spirits high. Shackleton understood something critical. Physical endurance mattered, but mental strength mattered more. Yet the ice was alive. It shifted, groaned, and heaved with terrifying force. Vast pressure ridges rose around the ship, slabs of ice colliding with such violence they sounded like cannon fire. The photographer, Frank Hurley, captured haunting images of the ship dwarfed by jagged towers of ice, as if nature itself was determined to crush their ambitions. On October 24, 1915, disaster struck. With a thunderous crack, the ice pierced the hull. Water gushed in. For 3 days, the men pumped without rest, hands frozen to the iron handles, muscles trembling from exhaustion. But it was futile. Shackleton finally gave the order no sailor ever wants to hear: abandon ship. From the ice, the men watched as the Endurance, their last connection to the world, was slowly destroyed. Her stern rose into the air, her timbers splintered, and then, with a final groan, she sank into the black water below. Shackleton wrote in his diary a single chilling line: "The ship and stores have gone. Our home is no more." Now there were 28 men stranded on drifting ice, hundreds of miles from land, with no radio, no hope of rescue, and only 3 small lifeboats. Their rations could last weeks at best. Shackleton quickly realized the truth. Their expedition had transformed into something far greater than exploration. It was now a fight for life itself. His plan was desperate. He aimed for Paulet Island, 550 kilometers away, where years earlier he had arranged for an emergency cache to be stored. The men lashed sledges to the lifeboats, loading them with supplies, and began dragging them across the ice. But the task was impossible. Each boat weighed nearly a ton, and the soft, melting ice swallowed their boots with every step. After 3 hours of agony, they had moved less than a mile. Shackleton made the call: abandon the march. They would set up a camp and let the drifting ice carry them closer to land. At Ocean Camp, their days fell into a harsh rhythm. Rations were cut to the bone: a single biscuit, a spoonful of powdered milk, and a bite of meat paste. Shackleton, always thinking of morale, would sometimes pretend they had more food than they really did, knowing hope was the most valuable ration of all. The men hunted seals and penguins, their greasy meat and blubber keeping them alive through the endless dark. But the ice betrayed them again. By March 1916, they spotted land at last: Joinville Island. Relief turned to despair when they realized the currents had carried them too far north. Paulet Island, with its precious supplies, was now hopelessly out of reach. Worse still, the floe beneath them was shrinking. Cracks appeared, splitting their camp into fragments. The men scrambled to save the boats as chunks of their icy home shattered and sank. It was now or never. Shackleton ordered the men into the lifeboats. For 7 days, they rode through a hellish landscape of freezing spray, towering waves, and drifting ice. Exhaustion gnawed at their bodies. Frostbite chewed at their hands. Some men hallucinated. Others collapsed. But then, after 497 days trapped on ice, they felt solid ground beneath their feet. On April 15, 1916, they staggered ashore on a desolate, wind-battered rock called Elephant Island. It was salvation, yet also a curse. Elephant Island was uninhabited, barren, and far from any shipping route. The men were alive, but no one would ever stumble upon them here. Their joy faded into grim silence. They had escaped one prison, only to be trapped in another. Shackleton knew waiting meant death, and so he made a decision that seemed almost impossible. He would take one of the small lifeboats, the James Caird, and sail 1,300 kilometers across the most violent ocean in the world to reach South Georgia Island, the same whaling station they had departed from nearly a year and a half earlier. The risks were unimaginable. The Drake Passage, known as the Sailor's Graveyard, was waiting with 12-meter waves, freezing gales, and storms that crushed even the strongest ships. Shackleton chose 5 companions for the attempt. The other 22, under the command of Frank Wild, would stay behind, huddled in makeshift huts built from overturned boats, clinging to the fragile promise that their leader would return. On April 24, 1916, the James Caird slipped into the sea, 6 men in a 22-foot boat facing the deadliest stretch of water on Earth. As the tiny craft vanished into the horizon, the 22 left behind on Elephant Island could only whisper the same prayer: "May the boss make it back." The James Caird was barely more than a lifeboat, 22 feet of wood and canvas facing the most unforgiving stretch of ocean on the planet. Shackleton and his 5 companions set out into the furious waters of the Southern Ocean, carrying nothing more than basic navigational tools, a sextant, and their sheer will to survive. For 16 days, the boat was tossed like a toy. Towering waves loomed over them, some as high as buildings, crashing down with the force of hammers. Freezing spray soaked them constantly, turning their clothes to ice. Sleep was almost impossible. They bailed water by hand for hours at a time, their fingers numb and swollen. Each sunrise felt like a small miracle. Navigation was nearly hopeless. They could only take readings when the clouds broke, which happened rarely. A single mistake in calculation would mean missing South Georgia entirely and vanishing forever into the Atlantic. Hunger gnawed at them, salt sores burned their skin, and seasickness left them weak. Yet Shackleton pushed forward, reminding himself that the lives of 22 men still stranded on Elephant Island depended on him. Then, just when hope seemed to wane, a miracle. On May 10, 1916, through the mist and storm, jagged cliffs appeared on the horizon. South Georgia. After 300 kilometers in an open boat, they had reached the island. But the ocean wasn't finished with them yet. A hurricane struck, lashing the small craft with winds so powerful it overturned a 500-ton steamer nearby. Somehow, the James Caird clung to survival. Battered and broken, the boat finally scraped onto the uninhabited side of the island, but salvation was still cruelly out of reach. The whaling station and rescue lay on the opposite coast, across a spine of mountains and glaciers that no one had ever crossed. Their boat was too damaged to risk sailing around. The only choice was the impossible one, a land crossing on foot. Shackleton, with 2 men, set off. They carried almost nothing, no tent, no sleeping bags, just a length of rope, a carpenter's adze, and a small stove. For 36 hours, they marched without rest. They climbed icy ridges, slid down glaciers, and listened to the roar of hidden crevasses beneath their boots. Shackleton described hearing ghostly music in the wind, as if the mountains themselves were testing them. Exhaustion blurred their vision, yet they pressed on, driven by the knowledge that every step was a step closer to saving their men. At last, they stumbled down into Stromness, the whaling station they had left nearly 2 years earlier. Shackleton and his companions were barely recognizable, bearded, blackened with soot, their clothes in tatters. The station manager stared in disbelief. The world had presumed Shackleton and his crew were long dead. Yet here he stood, very much alive, though haunted by the knowledge that 22 men still awaited him on Elephant Island. Shackleton wasted no time. He rescued the 3 men left behind on the other side of South Georgia, then turned all his efforts toward reaching Elephant Island. But nature continued its cruel game. 3 times ice drove back his rescue ships. Weeks dragged into months. Meanwhile, on Elephant Island, Frank Wild did everything to keep the others alive. Each morning, he gave the same order: "Pack your bags, boys. The boss may come today." It was a ritual of hope, keeping despair at bay. Finally, on August 30th, 1916, after 4 long months and nearly 2 years since their expedition had begun, a ship appeared on the horizon of Elephant Island. The men rushed to the shore, squinting into the spray, and there, on deck, they saw him, their commander, their boss. Shackleton had returned. With his voice trembling, Shackleton called across the water. Were they all safe? The answer came back, all safe, all well. Against all odds, he had done the impossible. Shackleton had taken 27 men into the Antarctic wilderness, and he was bringing all 27 home alive. When the last man stepped onto the rescue ship that day, the ordeal was finally over. For 634 days, nearly 2 years, Shackleton and his men had endured the harshest environment on Earth. They had faced hunger, freezing cold, exhaustion, and despair, yet not a single life was lost. It was, by every practical measure, a failed expedition. Shackleton never reached the South Pole. He never crossed Antarctica. The mission's scientific goals were abandoned the moment Endurance sank beneath the ice. Yet in failure lay a triumph so profound that it has inspired generations. The triumph of human resilience and leadership under impossible odds. Back in Britain, the story made headlines, though it was overshadowed by World War I. Shackleton offered his men to the government for military service, and many went straight from survival on the ice to the horrors of the battlefield. Some would not survive the war. But their bond, tempered by Antarctic hardship, remained unbreakable. Historians and psychologists have since studied Shackleton's leadership. What made his story extraordinary was not luck, but the way he guided his men. Shackleton's genius was his unshakable optimism. He shielded his crew from despair, always focusing on the next step, never the impossible whole. When rations ran low, he cut his own portions first. When morale faltered, he organized games, songs, even mock newspapers to keep spirits alive. He understood that survival was as much about hope as it was about food. Frank Wild, his second-in-command, mirrored that spirit. On Elephant Island, he led with calm determination, repeating each morning that, "The boss will come today," even as weeks dragged into months. His faith kept the men from collapsing into hopelessness. It was proof that leadership was not just about commands, but about carrying the weight of belief when others could not. The hidden truth of the Endurance saga is this: Shackleton's greatest success came not from reaching a destination, but from bringing every man home alive. He showed the world that failure of purpose is not the same as failure of humanity. His expedition has been called the greatest survival story ever told, not because of the ice, the storms, or the hunger, but because of the spirit that endured through it all. Even today, Shackleton's story resonates far beyond the world of exploration. Business leaders study his methods for crisis management. Psychologists analyze his resilience. Teachers share his journey as a lesson in teamwork, endurance, and hope. His name has become a symbol of courage in the face of impossible odds. But perhaps the most powerful legacy lies in what his men remembered. Decades later, survivors described Shackleton not as a flawless hero, but as a man who cared deeply for each of them, who carried their burdens, and who refused to give up. His leadership was not built on glory, it was built on loyalty. Standing on the deck of the rescue ship that day in August 1916, Shackleton looked at the weary faces of his men. They were thinner, older, marked forever by hardship, yet they were alive. That, he knew, was the only achievement that truly mattered. The world would call his expedition a failure. History would prove it was anything but. Shackleton had shown that even when dreams shatter and ships sink, the human spirit, driven by courage, compassion, and faith, can endure. So the next time you face an impossible challenge, remember this story. Remember that survival is not just about strength, but about hope. That leadership is not about glory, but about care. And that sometimes the greatest victories come not from reaching the destination, but from making sure no one is left behind. The legend closes here, but the shadows still whisper. The men of the Endurance survived, but not all forgotten explorers were so fortunate. Another untold truth lies buried in the shadows. Be here when it rises. Subscribe now to uncover the secrets that history tried to hide from you, and tell me in the comments, What do you think kept Shackleton's men alive? Was it luck, leadership, or something deeper? Your answer might shape the next hidden truth we reveal.